Hey there, this is Dan Hoffman bringing you some more pointers on setting up and creating a sustainable spiritual direction practice. The point of these little videos is to provide practical hints about getting a spiritual direction practice up and moving. Something that is tough and isn't always easy, but I want to bring my own experience and my own background to bear on this. These videos are for apprentices in the Soul Adventure Spiritual Direction Apprenticeship Program that I sponsor and have created. But they're also for anybody else. And so if you're a spiritual director or a recent graduate from another program, please feel welcome to sit in on these videos because they're meant really for everybody. So let's go to the topic today, which is the intake. I know intake is a sort of cold and almost like hospital-like term. But intake really means getting the information on the table from both sides before the spiritual direction relationship begins. And so I'd like to share with you my own experience in this and the steps I actually ask prospective clients, prospective seekers to go through with me as they come into spiritual direction as I offer it. So let's start out just with the idea that I get a phone call or an email or a text message or even a reference from somebody and they say, I'm really interested in spiritual direction. And these people may have had some spiritual direction in the past. They may be shifting for whatever reason, or they may have heard about spiritual direction and are a little fascinated or intrigued by what it is. And so I ask people to not jump in, but to work with me over a series of steps as we come to a mutual conclusion that spiritual direction relationship would be good for both of us. So the first step, obviously, is the contact. And I think it's important in the contact not to sit around and wait for any time at all to answer. I have a basic policy that if people contact me by way of my website, and by the way, you probably want to have a website in these times, but if people contact me by way of my website, I really say on the website, I will be in touch with you within 24 hours. And I think that is a good customer service approach to prospective clients. And they all do appreciate it. And you hear stories kind of like nightmare stories of people that tried to be in touch with a spiritual director, and finally, after 3 or 4 weeks, if at all, they get a response. And by that time, they've moved on to someone else. There are plenty of spiritual directors. So there's that, the contact itself. And during the first contact, I usually say to people, well, hey, you know what? I do offer spiritual direction in my home, in this very space that you're seeing now on the video. But I really would like to meet with you in a public space and for us to have a little conversation. And then I tell the person, from your side, it will be an interview. You can ask me any question you want, and I will answer it in the best way I can. And equally, I may have a couple of questions for you, and I also have some disclosures that I want to put on the table right at the beginning. So people say, yeah, hey, that's good. And coffee shops are a great place for this if they're not too loud and if there aren't too many tables so close that people next door to you hear everything that you're sharing. That isn't always cool. But in a city like mine, Indianapolis, there's a huge number of there are a huge number of coffee shops, and so I usually find one that is relatively quiet and in which the tables are spaced out. Um, spaced out. So there's that, and the person says yes. Hey, let's do that. Um, One reason I do that is that since I offer spiritual direction in my house, I really want to sort of vet the person or get a gut feeling of who this person is before they walk into my living room, which is where I offer spiritual direction. And I like to do that because I I often don't know the people, or I don't know even the people that referred them. And I want to be careful about who comes in the front door. I'll be honest about that. There's a knife caddy in the kitchen, and I'm always aware of that. I mean, I want to be sure that I'm safe, even as I try to provide a very safe environment for the client. So we meet at a coffee shop. And when we do meet at this coffee shop, I usually take the initiative to tell the person just one or two things. I try to share a little bit my definition of spiritual direction. I try to ask them, not necessarily in this order, but I try to ask them what led them to want spiritual direction. What is it they're looking for in spiritual direction? Do they have a past in spiritual direction of any kind in any church? These are our starter questions, and one of these questions will lead to a vast amount of information that will be useful. Then I also try to issue some disclaimers, and I tell people that when I meet with them, that I hold everything in strict confidence, that if they come into this house, it's like walking into a vault. None of the information that comes into this house leaves this house in any form. And I want them to know that and feel safe with it. Really, the confidentiality piece is the, I'd say in a way, the core piece that allows people to feel safe and that where they feel that they can trust the situation. So I make that clear right up front. So we have our conversation. They ask me questions. Questions might be, where did you study? How long have you been offering spiritual direction? Can you tell me about your spiritual life? How do you experience prayer? They'll try to work on these questions. Sometimes they'll try to tease out attitudes. They might, if they don't know, for example, that I'm an out gay man, they might, well, how do you feel about gender and gender issues? They might work on that a little bit, gender orientation issues. Or they might want to know a little specific about my church background. And so I try to be honest and forthcoming in all of my answers, because if the person hangs out in spiritual direction as a client, sooner or later they're going to know all this anyway. So I think the idea that they're empowered to interview, just like you would for a person for a job, I think that's a really important thing for them to feel. So we've met at the coffee shop, and does that mean that the next day we're in a permanent spiritual direction practice relationship of some kind? No, it doesn't. Because the next step I ask for them to consider is that, and they don't have to decide on the spot, they can decide according to their own rhythm and timeline. I ask them to come over to the house for a free, non-obligation test session. And I tell them I'll offer this session in the way I offer spiritual direction. And in that way, you can actually judge whether my style or the way I offer spiritual direction is compatible with what you need and what you're looking for. And if not, then no problem, nothing lost, and you're on your way to the next spiritual director. Or if they do want to continue, then they will have known exactly what's up. In my case, my spiritual direction practice is a little bit, I would say, engaged, in the sense that there is a lot of back and forth. It's not mostly a matter of me taking in information sort of passively without bringing back questions or comments or feedback. And that is not the case in all spiritual direction. Much good spiritual direction is done very, very differently than the way I do it. So anyway, the person then says, yeah, hey, I'll pull out my calendar. We look on our calendars, we get a good date, and the date comes around. They come into the house. Normally in this house, let me see if I can show it to you here a little bit. But it's a comfortable sort of a mid-century looking kind of operation here. You can see it. They'll come in that door that you can see over there, and often they'll smile when they first come in. And I'm very aware that people, when they assume a commitment to a spiritual director, or even say, let's say, a therapist or a life coach or a pastor for a meeting, that they can be anxious about that. And so I like to be as welcoming as I possibly can. I always have a bottle of water sitting on the table. There's always a candle lit, and I'm ready to go. So we have our session. And we have our session that lasts basically 45 minutes. It's a little abbreviated. And at the end of the session, I asked the person, well, would you like to debrief a little bit? How did you experience this? How did you relate to the way, to the questions that I may have asked? Is there anything you'd like to ask now? Or is there even a suggestion you'd like to make based just on this one experience? And so that happens. And I don't encourage people to make an immediate decision. Even then, I ask them to give it a little more time and think about it, mainly because one of the markers of the way I offer spiritual direction is that I basically subscribe to the idea that good spiritual direction, a good spiritual direction relationship, really should be monthly. And I think this is pretty tested and true and standard information. I don't feel uncomfortable with a bi-monthly relationship. I do feel uncomfortable, and I spill this out to people right at the beginning. I don't feel very comfortable with every 3 or 4 months or just whenever, because in those cases, it's almost always like starting all over again. And there's just a loss of maybe my mojo as that happens. And I think it's true also for the client. Now, at this second session, or maybe even before, I will show a person, a client, or a prospective client, this book by John Mabry, which is called Starting Spiritual Direction. I very, very highly recommend this book, and I'll put the reference in the notes for the YouTube video. But in this book, Reverend Mabry, who is a spiritual director himself, is a very, I think, longtime member and a person associated with Spiritual Directors International. He talks about all the issues that people need to think about as they walk into spiritual direction. And the subtitle for his book is A Guide to Getting Ready, Feeling Safe, and Getting the Most Out of Your Sessions. It's a wonderful book. It aligns very much with the way I offer spiritual direction. And so I recommend to people that they get the book and that they read it before our first formal session. And almost everybody does, not quite everybody does. Why do I do all of this prep work, this intake work? Well, the reason is when I first started spiritual direction, I've always been blessed with references and clients. And when I first started spiritual direction, I started noticing that people really didn't know what it was at all, and that I had not been really well prepared for articulating the kind of relationship that we were involved in. I knew, for example, no, it's not therapy. And I knew, for example, that we're looking at the inner life and we're teasing out what's going on with the Spirit and by the Spirit in people's lives. But it was hard to convey that to people. And many people whose experience has been largely in therapy, and that is a lot of people nowadays, it was harder to express the what we do in spiritual direction. And so I felt as though meeting initially in a coffee shop, then allowing for an actual experience, then reading the book, gives a really groundwork, a foundation for a relationship that can be sustainable and in some cases may last for many years. I can say that since I've been doing this, the whole conversation about, well, what really is spiritual direction? It really has receded into the background. People walk in with a fairly clear idea of what spiritual direction is. So let's say that the client, whoever, they have come to the conclusion that yes, hey, this would be all right. I'd like to work with you. So I tell them, okay, let's give it, let's make this commitment. And here is an agreement form that just spells out very roughly some of my core principles like confidentiality and starting on time. And it spells out the payment range. And it's just one side of one page with maybe 3 paragraphs. And I say, we need to sign this just so that we have on record what our agreement is as we move into this next time. So I get that back, we schedule, and we're off and running. But I also tell people, we're going to be off and running, but after about 4 sessions or 5, I'd like to stop and give time to an evaluation and a conversation about the sessions. And this I've found has been very valuable because when people know it's coming, they're able to hold things and they bring them to the table and we clarify as we're going. And if, as can happen, if somehow I've missed the mark, they will tell me because they have a permission structure to talk about this and to share with me. So this is my intake process for spiritual direction as I offer it. And I do want to commend it to you, or some version of it that you feel comfortable with. And I'd like to invite you to share with me at any point if you have a system or a methodology that you yourself have developed. Finally, I want to say that I had really good spiritual direction training. I don't have any question about that. But the practical part, some of these practicalities were not really well addressed at the end. And I think that these are very important things to keep in mind, especially if you've been in a spiritual direction program that is heavy on spiritual formation, as well as the nuts and bolts of putting together a spiritual direction practice. Whether you're dealing with one person or 30 or somewhere in between, I hope that all of these little suggestions will be useful to you. And I surely wish you all the best as you reach out with the Spirit to people that come your way. Blessings.